Welcome to Nazarene Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the faith once delivered to the saints. And today's presentation is on the 8th day assembly, or what's called in Hebrew, Shemini Atzeret. And Shemini Atzeret is one of the 7 festivals that were handed down to the nation of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai under the leadership of Moshe, or Moses the prophet. Now, it's the same calendar that the Messiah and his apostles still kept in the first century. So if you're like me and you want to imitate the Messiah and walk even as he walked, then I encourage you to go to the NazareneIsrael.org website, where you can download a PDF copy of the Torah calendar for free. You can also read it free on the pages of the website, or you can purchase a paperback copy at our cost from Amazon.com. So the 7 original festivals that were given to Israel in the wilderness are broken down into 2 groups. There's 3 are what are called the spring feasts, Passover, unleavened bread, and Pentecost. And then we have 4 of what are called the fall feasts. And the last 2 are tabernacles, also called the Feast of Sukkot, followed immediately by the 8th day assembly, or Shemini Atzeret. And we're going to take a look. We're going to see a lot of, we'll talk more in this presentation about how the festivals are prophetic shadow pictures of coming things. And we talked about that in the Tabernacles or Sukkot video. We also discuss it in the book. But one of the things that we see is we see mirror imaging from spring to fall. So in the spring festivals, we see the Passover, which is a 1-day feast, or technically it's a half a day, and then followed by the 7 days of unleavened bread. And then in the fall feasts, what we see is the 7 days of tabernacles or Sukkot, followed by an 8th day assembly. So those 2 go together. What we're going to see is Sukkot and the 8th day assembly go together. So let's take a look at the Torah commandment. It's a good place to start. We take a look in Leviticus chapter 23, starting in verse 39, where it says, "Also on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you've gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep the feast of Yahweh for 7 days." So it's a 7-day feast for the Feast of Tabernacles. It says, "On the first day there shall be a Sabbath rest, and on the 8th day a Sabbath rest." So people ask, how can you have an 8th day if it's only a 7-day festival? And the answer is because Shemini Atzeret is the 8th day. And this explains the name that's given to it. So we take a look at the word in Hebrew, Shemini. It's Strong's Hebrew or Old Testament 8066, Shemini. It comes from Old Testament 8083, Shmone, meaning 8. So it's the 8th. And then we take a look at the next word we have there is Atzeret, and that is Strong's Hebrew or Old Testament 6116, comes from the root word of 6113, which we'll look at in just a moment. And it refers to an assembly, especially a festival that takes place, or an assembly, especially an assembly that takes place on a festival or on a holiday, as we'll see that Shemini Atzeret does. So let's take a look now at the root. It's Strong's Hebrew or Old Testament 6113 is atzar, a primitive root. It means to enclose, by analogy to hold back. And of course, if you're going to hold them back, then you're going to have another assembly. So we don't let the people go home. So what is the, people say, well, what is the meaning behind this? So what's happened is we've just had 7 days of Sukkot or tabernacles, where we have dwelled in Sukkot, we've also dwelled in tents, we've rejoiced with the 4 species, we have shared fellowship and friendship, we've had good teaching and singing and dancing, praise and worship, and then now on the 8th day, so we had 7 full days of that, and then now on the 8th day, we're going to break camp, we're going to gather, assemble, and we're going to meet together, we're going to eat together and pray together, and then the people are going to go home. So that is one of the ways that on the 8th day, we don't use the 4 species, and we don't have a requirement to dwell in Sukkot. We also don't have a requirement to dwell in tents, and the reason why is because we're breaking camp and going home. So these things are not needed. They're not necessary. So we get 7 full days with Sukkot, with 4 species, with tents, and then an 8th day, which is a partial day, that those things are not required. So let's take a look again. So Leviticus chapter 23, starting this time in verse 33. Just back up a few verses from where we were before. It says, verse 33, Leviticus 23 and verse 33 says, Then Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to Yahweh. He says, On the first day there shall be a set-apart gathering. You shall do no customary work on it. So this will be the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. So he continues on in Leviticus 23 and verse 36. He says, For 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh. He says, and then on the 8th day you shall have a set-apart rehearsal. And we're going to take a look at this in a moment. It says a Mikra Kodesh. It's a set-apart gathering or a set-apart rehearsal, because that's implied by the word Mikra. We'll take a look at that next. It says, And you shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh. He says, It is a solemn assembly, and you shall do no customary work on it. So the whole day, although we do break camp and go home, the entire day is dedicated to the purpose of this gathering and this rehearsal. So let's take a look at the word mikra that we saw there, that it is so that's Strong's Hebrew or Old Testament 4744, and we're not going to go into the same detail that we went into with the Feast of Tabernacles video. So if you have questions on this, you can look it up in the book study, or you also refer to that, to the Tabernacles study. But it's Strong's Hebrew or Old Testament 4744 is mikra, means something called out. It's a public meeting. It's a public gathering. So mikra, so kara is like to cry. So we would have a town crier, hear ye, and would gather all the people to the town square, and they would have a meeting. Now this is like that, except it's also a rehearsal. And in the last video and in the book study, we saw that the festivals are prophetic shadow pictures of coming things. So the question comes up, what are they prophetic shadow pictures of? So as we take a look, Passover in the spring feasts, Passover is symbolic of leaving Egypt or leaving the world system behind and going back to dwell in the Father's house, because we know Yeshua is there to prepare a place for us. And along the way, Pentecost, which takes place in the early summer, that's where the bride receives her covenant. It's the Torah, and that's a set of rules and things that the Son wants us to do in order to become more pleasing to him in that day. Tabernacles is a picture of married life in the Millennium, and then Shemini Atzeret, since we're held back, since we're enclosed, we're retained, we're detained. Basically, it's similar to the Christian Terry service. It's just stay a little while longer. You're going to keep you for a little while. We're going to take a look at the prophetic significance of that coming up. But a lot of people a lot of the Christian churches teach a dogma or a teaching, and they have what they call a 7,000-year plan. And it's a good basis. We need to modify it just a little. You may have heard this. They talk about Yahweh has a 7,000-year plan, 6,000 years for man, plus 1,000 years for Yahweh. And we would agree with that, and we're going to show you the prophetic foundation and basis of that, but we would say 7,000 years plus a little, plus just a little, because we're going to see we're retained beyond the full 7,000 years. So if we go to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, we're told that in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. So beginning from day 1, and then going on, if we go to Genesis chapter 2 and verse 2, we're told, and on the 7th day, Elohim ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. So we have now a history from the first day to the 7th day, but what we need to understand is what the Apostle Peter, or Kepha, tells us in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8, where he says, Beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with Yahweh, meaning in prophecy, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as one day. So what we're going to see is that these 7,000 years, or these 7 days of the creation week, are prophetic and symbolic of a 7,000-year history, and then we need to add just a little because of the Feast of Shemini Atzeret. What we need to understand is what the apostle Kepha or Peter tells us in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8, which is where he says, "Beloved, do not forget this one thing, that with Yahweh," meaning in prophecy, "one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as one day." So what we see by this is that the 7 days of the creation week all of a sudden now represent 7,000 years of prophecy. But we can't just say 7,000 years, we have to say plus a little, because what we're going to see is at the end of, in this dogma, it's broken down into 6,000 years for man, and the 7,000 years, or what's called the Millennium, for Yahweh. And then according to that doctrine, the earth is burned up immediately at the end of that 1,000 years. But we know that that's not the case from passages such as Revelation chapter 20, starting in verse 7, which tells us that there's more things that go on after the 1,000 years have expired. For example, Revelation 20 and verse 7 says, "Now when the 1,000 years have expired," so the millennium's done, and there's more to do. And it says, "Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea." So what we see then is the earth has to continue on a little while past the 7,000 year mark in order for this second war of Gog and Magog to take place. I'm going to touch on this briefly in an image. Now, this graphic is extracted from the study Revelation and the End Times. And I'm not going to explain the whole graphic. We explained it in the Revelation study. But the second line from the bottom, where you see the tank, to the right of that is Armageddon, and also Gog 1, and following Armageddon is the ingathering, when Ephraim and Judah come home. After this ingathering, or the second Exodus, we have 1,000-year period, which is commonly referred to as the Millennium. And then when the Millennium ends, what we just read in Revelation chapter 20 and verse 7, after the Millennium, once the Millennium has ended, that's when the second war of Gog and Magog takes place. So what we see then is that the earth has to continue on a little while after the millennium is over in order for the rest of the prophecies to be fulfilled. And some people liken this to what's called a tarry service, just continuing on a little while. Don't go home yet. So again, if you want to know more about that graphic, I strongly recommend you can go to the NazareneIsrael.org website. You can download a PDF copy of Revelation and the End Times. You can read it free online on the website, or you can purchase a paperback copy at our cost from Amazon.com. But we talk about the prophetic significance of the Eighth Day Assembly. So when we talk about the Eighth Day Assembly, we have to talk about it in context with the Feast of Tabernacles. Now we know from the last video and also from the book study that Yeshua was born on the first day of the Feast of Sukkot, the first day of Tabernacles. And this is why Luke chapter 2 and verse 7 says that when Miriam had brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths, she laid him in a manger, or a sukkah, or a booth, or a temporary dwelling, because there was no room for them in the inn, thereby fulfilling at least the first prophetic fulfillment of the Feast of Tabernacles. Now we also want to take a look at the fulfillment on the eighth day. We believe Yeshua was circumcised on the eighth day of Sukkot, because Leviticus chapter 12 and verse 3 tells us that on the eighth day, the flesh of a male's foreskin shall be circumcised. So this is something that would have happened or taken place for Yeshua during the day of the eighth day assembly. So now let's take a look at the prophetic significance of that, and we're going to see some prophetic shadow pictures or prophetic shadow images in the sacrifices that are made during these times. So in Leviticus chapter 22, starting in verse 26, it says, "And Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, when a bull or a sheep or a goat is born, any clean animal, it shall be 7 days with its mother." I didn't want to put Mother Earth there, but some people draw that parallel. It says, "And from the eighth day and thereafter, it shall be accepted as an offering made by fire to Yahweh." So what we need to see there is that the earth ends up being burned up sometime during the 8th day. It doesn't happen immediately at the end of the 7th day. It happens sometime during the 8th day. And this is what Kepha, or Peter, refers to in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10, where he tells us, "But the day of Yahweh will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up." And again, this is going to take place not exactly at the end of the millennium, but has to take place sometime during the 8th day. So for another witness, we have Exodus chapter 22 and verse 30. He says, "Likewise, you shall do with your oxen and your sheep," again, more clean animals. "It shall be with its mother 7 days, and on the 8th day you shall give it to me." So this gives us an insight as to why the Apostle Paul is telling us that don't let anyone but the body of Messiah judge you with regard to how you obey Yahweh's calendar, because everything in the Torah is prophetic shadow pictures of things still to come. If you'd like to know more information, I encourage you to go to the NazareneIsrael.org website. You can download a copy of the Torah calendar in PDF form, or you can purchase a paperback copy at our cost from Amazon.com. And we'd like to welcome you to all the other resources we have at the NazareneIsrael.org website. Shalom.